I'm Kathleen Gent with the Community Senior Center, and looking forward to a fine presentation this afternoon. I do want to note that Tegan and Mount Mansfield Cable TV are filming today, and you'll be able to watch this presentation at a future date on local access TV. And I do want to thank Ian Stokes for providing AV technical support today, and certainly want to welcome all of you. Our presenter today is Joe Roman, and Joe is a Richmond resident. About a year ago, I was watching Across the Fence on WCAX, and the host began interviewing Joe. I said, "That's my neighbor Joe." He was beautifully explaining a whole new world to me about systems with whales and plants and birds and all kinds of systems that I had not really thought about before. And that really is the focus of Joe's work. So it's great that Joe is with us today. And without further ado, I'll introduce Joe. I do want to let folks know we have a microphone, and so when you have questions, if you could just let me know and I'll get the microphone to you so we can capture everything on MMC TV. Any questions or any comments before we get started? Okay, thank you. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathleen. And it is really, I traveled a fair amount for this book, and it's lovely to come like 3 blocks up the road just to chat. And you probably, for those, how many people live in Richmond or close by? Pretty much everyone. You may recognize one of the characters in the story. So on November 14th, 1963, there was a fishing boat off the southeast coast of Iceland. And it was dark. The cook got up to make breakfast, and he smelled sulfur. So he woke up the engineer on the boat and said, "Is there anything problem with the engine?" The engineer checked. Everything was fine. And then they noticed that they were caught in a whirlpool. And soon there was an eruption column that was about 500 feet in the air and eventually extended to more than a mile into the sky. Iceland is on the mid-Atlantic ridge, so it's between 2 tectonic plates, lots of volcanic activity. So this was it was occurring at this eruption along the ridge, about 400 to 500 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. So this is what the island looked like a couple of months later. You can see the black lava here, and now you've got the tephra and the dust going into the sky several miles into the air, and a new island started to form. About 25 square meters of lava every minute or so. So every day, about a pyramid of Giza, one of the great pyramids, was forming in this area. So it quickly got a reputation as the newest island in the world in the 1960s. A French journalist went out there. He was the first person to set foot, and the eruption was so active that he had to retreat. Icelanders got a bit upset, so then they went out onto the island. One of the volcanologists said, "When you're standing on the island, you don't want to run from the lava boulders in the sky. You wait until it's right above you, and then you run." And the ship would go back well off the island, but eventually things started to settle down. And Icelanders made what I think as a scientist a great decision. They thought about whether it should be open for tourism or what should they do with this new land, and they decided to make it a living laboratory. So this is what Surtsey Island looks like now. Surtsey is named after Surtur, who's the Nordic giant of fire. And it has been protected now for over 60 years. It's a living lab. It's a World Heritage Site, not because it's a young island, which it is, but because no people are allowed on that island. 2 weeks a year, biologists are allowed on for 1 week, and geologists are allowed on for another week, and that's it. By the way, in the 1960s and 1970s, the US recognized the value of this, and the US Atomic Energy started to fund research there because it wanted to know what life would be like after an atomic blast, and this was as close as they were going to get. I was lucky enough to join this group in 2021 to be one of the biologists there for a couple of days. So, what does CSC look like? For the most part, it's black lava and a few plants that can float in on the ocean and provide their own nitrogen, provide their own nutrients. So lava is rich in phosphorus, but it doesn't have much nitrogen, which is essential for plant growth as well as animal growth. Without that nitrogen, very few things can survive. The first 2 birds to land on this island are here. They were black guillemots, rather to be born on that island. I spoke with Erling Olafsson, who's the biologist holding these birds. First 2 birds known to be raised on the island. The cool thing about going out there is a lot of the researchers are older than the island itself. So you're walking around with people that have been around studying this since before CSC emerged. And in fact, some of the birds are likely older than the island itself, because birds can also live several decades. So, these are the first 2 birds. Most of CSC looked like this, and still does now. It's just these plants that float in the ocean that have a lot of nitrogen packed into their seeds. So maritime plants like sea sand or oyster leaf, they float in along the coast and they're growing in this area. So you have just a very few, maybe 3 or 4 species that can survive on this island. What changed? What allowed other species to survive? That happens in the birds. So the birds are feeding in the ocean, and they're feeding on krill and fish, and they're breeding on this land. There were just a few birds at first, but by the 1980s, 20 years after Iceland emerged, there were several hundred seagulls and other birds breeding on this island. Each bird releases about 3 ounces of poop per day, but that adds up when you've got a lot of species or a lot of individuals that are all breeding in a particular area. So on CSC, birds deposit about 60 pounds of nitrogen on the breeding area per acre per year. And that's comparable to what a farmer would put on a managed pasture, what you would put on a pasture. So what kind of impact does that have? Again, here's what most of the island looks like without birds. And then this is the seabird colony. 50 times the biomass and a lot of new species of grasses. So the grasses, which couldn't survive before the birds, landed on there and then had the nitrogen in order to grow. So it looks like a meadow. And if you walk on the black lava, you can cut your boots. It's very dangerous. But once you get here, it feels really springy, and it feels almost like you're walking on a trampoline, right? And the grass is up to about knee level. I work as a biologist. I look at the role of animals, like how do animals influence ecosystems? It's really hard to tease these things apart. I mostly work in the ocean, but you can look out the window in Vermont too, and it's like, well, what's the influence of people? What's the influence of animals? Would the plants grow here anyway? They've been here for hundreds of thousands of years. In this case, these biologists have been following almost every individual. Early on, they named every plant and every bird. They also followed the insects that were coming in there. Not only do the birds bring in the nitrogen, but they also, on their feathers or in their gullets, brought in seeds. So there are now about 80 species of plants in that area. Most of the diversity is around this seabird area. And you can see the difference from space. As one of my colleagues said, who's an ecologist, you rarely get this system because ecology isn't rocket science, it's a lot harder. Because there are millions of things that are changing all the time. In this case, we really have a good idea across a couple of decades of how animals can make a distinct difference. This gives you an idea of the timeline of the different plant species and the different bird species that arrived in Surtsey. So the sea rocket and sea sandwort, those are the ones with the big seeds with lots of nutrients they can survive. The fulmars, the kittiwakes, and the gulls are what really make a difference. And then you get the annual grasses, and you get even orchids have arrived in this area now, and willows. So it's the gulls that made all the difference. And now you also have snow buntings, which are insectivores. So with the plants came the insects, and then came the insectivorous birds. Goose also arrived in now. Puffin are starting to nest there. I spoke to one of the biologists, and he said, in the end, Surtsey will probably be the land of the puffin. As it erodes away, it's going to have those sharp edges and look more like the cliff edges that you associate with puffins. So you see that change over time. In the lifetime of a human, you see this enormous ecological change. Other animals that have come onto that area are also seals. So gray seals pup in this area. I just cut and pasted. That's not on top of this. But this is their breeding area over there. And you can see the green growth there. So they're coming in, they're pooping, their placentas are also released in that area. And it's comparable to what the gulls are doing, though it's low-lying, so it's more susceptible to tidal and waves. So it's far more dynamic than the upland grasslands. But still, they make a big impact and bring a comparable amount of nitrogen into that area. You can see it from space, so this is what Surtsey Island looks like. And there's the breeding area. So you can see the difference that the seabirds make. It's a little bit harder to make out the seals, but in that graph on the left, it's the gull colonies in the blue and the red, the seal colony in the purple, and with no animals, there's very little plant cover in that area. So clear evidence that these animals are having an impact on this island. So that gives you really, I think, hopefully a very strong example of how animals might shape one island ecosystem, but I figured I'd throw it out there. Anybody have some ideas of, and I can repeat it for the TV, of what animals might shape ecosystems in Vermont? Yeah.
Beaver.
Beaver's a classic example. They're engineers. You can see the way they're forming and how they change the river systems and the areas around it. Absolutely, I think, good example. Other thoughts?
Deer.
Deer, certainly, and deer populations, as we know, were declined until the 1950s and really increased. And you can see when you do exposures, experiments where you keep deer out of a particular area, you can see different undergrowth. So deer certainly have an impact on oceans. Well, and coyotes may be here. Wolves would in Vermont, historically, for sure. But wolves, there's certainly a lot of evidence. Actually, it's kind of controversial, but there's a lot of reporting on the role that wolves might have on the growth of aspens and others, for example, in Yellowstone.
How about bear?
I was thinking of Yellowstone area.
Right, the Yellowstone. Yeah, I mean, a fabulous and interesting story about when wolves were extirpated and they were restored to Yellowstone in the 1990s. And there have been some changes in the area in Yellowstone in elk behavior, elk numbers, and then also forest systems in that area, especially along river systems. Though, unlike Surtsey, that one is still very much among scientists, actively debated about how big the wolf influence was there.
Do bears have an impact?
Bears? I'm sure they do. I don't know if they've been studied here in Vermont. Certainly brown bears, there's been a fair amount of research on brown bears and salmon and moving nutrients from river systems away from there. But bears are a good example that I don't know if there's been any studies here in Vermont. Last one.
jumping worms and ash borers, small things.
Oh yeah, sure. So we haven't really mentioned insects or worms, so jumping worms and ash borers. Invasive species like that are another one like Surtsey where it's relatively easy to study because it's this perturbation. They weren't there, they come in, what kind of impacts do they have? Certainly insects and the small animals have an outsized impact on that area. So beavers were already mentioned. They were extirpated mostly from Vermont by the 1800s because of hunting and also because of the trees were basically cut. There were not many trees. They returned mostly by reintroduction in the 1920s, though there were probably a few beavers that were here. I looked up this morning, I couldn't find how many beavers are in Vermont. I don't know, I looked up a couple of the state systems, so I don't know how many were there at now. I wouldn't be surprised if 10,000 or a bit more, but I'm guessing there. Moose are also another good example, and kind of like the seabirds, and we'll talk about whales in a moment. What they do is they're moving these nutrients from aquatic systems, so they're feeding often in lakes or along rivers and streams, and then they're resting, digesting, and pooping in forest systems. One biologist estimated that each moose moves about a 40-pound bag of fertilizer uphill each year. So they're also moving this nitrogen back up into the uplands. And then a newcomer relative to, again, or one that's returned to Vermont are bald eagles, one of the last states where bald eagles started nesting again. They were down to only about 500 breeding pairs in the 1960s. There were about 71,000 across the US now. I saw one when I was recently giving a talk, and I thought, well, I wonder what impact bald eagles have. And I found this study, thought it was relevant here because there's a study on bald eagles and dairy farms. And one is that they're often deterring waterfowl and starlings in areas, so they're displacing animals that can damage or contaminate crops, and they're also moving nutrients from streams into the uplands and feeding on carcasses and placentas. So they may be providing a service as well now that we're having these numbers restored in Vermont to dairy farms around here. And then, of course, this is my dog. If any of you have seen me walking around, that's Zoe. So dogs, of course, were our own domestic animals. Cows, dogs move a lot of nutrients around as well. Every day I am out walking and she's peeing and she's releasing nutrients in that area. And in some areas where this has been studied, that's the most of the nutrient transport is either going to be through dogs or, not surprisingly, through domestic animals. So, one way that we can think about how animals move nutrients across ecosystems, and this is right now, I'm showing you summer coming in the northern hemisphere, and these are tags on individual animals, thousands of animals that are migrating across the planet. And I think of it in a sense as how animals are the circulatory system of the planet. We think of plants as the lungs, as taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, but they stay in one place. Animals are moving vast distances every year and taking those nutrients across ecosystems. So it's not only in these small distances that we've been talking about, birds traveling a couple of 100 kilometers, but also animals moving enormous distances, thousands of miles every year. But the biggest migration on the planet is actually in the oceans and also here in Lake Champlain. It's occurring every day. And it is what's called deal vertical migration or daily vertical migration. So animals like krill or fish or zooplankton are near the surface feeding on phytoplankton or algae, which are growing at the surface of either the lake or the oceans at night when they're protected from visual predators, and then during the day, they migrate hundreds of yards, hundreds of feet down in order to avoid predation and possibly for other reasons, and then they're coming back up to the surface. So we're having this migration every day. That's really, even though we're thinking about these long distance migrations, that's one of the dominant movements by animals on the planet. I learned about this biological pump in the 1990s when I was a master's student at the University of Florida. So when these animals are moving, they're also bringing nutrients down. So they're feeding at the surface, and then they're defecating or dying. They're bringing the carbon and other nutrients down. It's called a biological pump. Really important for carbon sequestration, as it turns out, because a lot of carbon is going into the deep sea this way. When I saw this in the 1990s, I had been working as a whale biologist for a number of years, and just that summer, been offshore in the Bay of Fundy and thought, there's one group that does something a little bit different than this biological pump, and it's right whales and other whales. And recently, a couple of years ago, I was insulating my attic and I found my notes from that lecture on the biological pump. And this isn't here, I think it's too far to see back there. But it's right whales, which is the species I was studying. They would often come to the surface with mud on their bonnets because they were feeding at the bottom of the Bay of Fundy. And then they come to the surface, of course, to breathe, but also to rest and digest. And often just before they dive, they release a big fecal plume, like sometimes as large as the boat. So I had noted, they're releasing feces at the surface. Maybe that can be picked up by phytoplankton or the algae, consumed by the zooplankton or the copepods, which are what the right whales eat. This had nothing to do with the research I was doing at that time, which was on turtles and other things. But I noted it, it was sort of in the back of my mind. There are sadly only about 400 right whales in the North Atlantic right now. They're probably not having a big impact. So even then I wondered, what was it like when there were 10,000 whales? So what was it like when whales were abundant? What kind of impact would they have? A few years later, I met Jim McCarthy. He's an oceanographer at Harvard, and he was one of the few oceanographers that was willing to entertain this crazy idea that whales might actually have what we describe as a whale pump, that they might actually have an influence on ocean ecosystems. One of his colleagues, when I mentioned this to him, said, well, sure, Joe, maybe there's some nitrogen, that nutrient again, in whale feces, but is it ecologically important or is it fighting a hurricane, right? So that's what I've been trying to work out, is how big of an influence do they have? So Jim and I built a model. He spent his career studying nitrogen in the oceans, and I had been studying whales, so we sort of combined our expertise to build a model to say, well, how much nitrogen do these whales move, and is it ecologically important? So our study was in the Gulf of Maine. Here are whales. They bring more nitrogen than all the rivers combined into that system, and comparable to coastal point source nowadays, which is human sources, not as much as the atmosphere, but 24,000 metric tons. So a lot of nitrogen is going into that system every year. And by the way, birds are doing this too, and seals are moving these nutrients too. But whales, the largest animals to ever live on the planet, had the biggest influence. So we described this as a whale pump, and it was rejected. It was rejected by a journal in part because they said, well, you guys are right, you're living right along the Gulf of Maine, but this is just a model. Why don't you go out and collect some and show us how much nitrogen is in these feces and what the impact might be, which is the last thing you want to hear as a scientist. But we recognized, well, they're probably right, and why not spend some time on the water? The problem is, whale feces can be hard to find. Basically, you're following whales around all day, and you're waiting for the fecal plume. So how could we optimize that was the question. So Popular Science quickly described this work as one of the worst jobs in science. I could think of others, but if you do, the whale feces can be incredibly strong smelling. If you get it on your clothes, you can't wash the smell out. Basically, you have to throw the clothes away. That's true for the right whales, my favorite species. Humpback whales are a little less powerful. But we still had a hard time finding these samples. So my colleague Roz Rolland thought, maybe we can use a technique that people use on land to find animals and to find scats on the ocean. So here are here's a couple of different examples of what whale feces looks like. And I think in a lot of ways, it reminds me of, for me, I feel like Wilson Bentley, like Snowflake Bentley whenever I find a fecal sample, in that they're like masterpieces of design, and everyone is different, and they really are. The colors are different, the shapes are different, and you can see here, this is from a humpback whale calf, sperm whales, when they're feeding on krill is floating at the surface. But you get an idea of just the diversity that you can find. But it's still hard to find these samples. So the technique that Roz Rolland and others came up with is why not use scat detecting dogs in order to help find these samples. So this is Fargo. There's a 90-pound Rottweiler who was a companion dog to an elderly woman. And when she went into assisted living, he started working as a sniffer dog in the prison systems of Washington State, looking for drugs. And then he got what I think for many dogs is a dream job, which is wildlife detecting dog. So he worked on looking for grizzly scats and puma scats and a whole bunch of different ones on land. Roz said, would it work on the water as well? The ocean is easier in one sense because you don't have hills, you don't have trees, so the scent is coming from, and the scent is usually coming from one other direction. Hard part, of course, is the dog can't run on water, so it's up to the driver. And Fargo got seasick. So we had to have Dramamine before every trip out there. His colleague Bob was terrified of whales. So that's a North Atlantic right whale, so he would cower on the bottom of the boat whenever a whale came up. Bob ended up retiring to a farm in Vermont. But Fargo made it for a couple of seasons and found really enhanced the amount of samples that we could collect. So if for humans, maybe in a good day, we can find 2 or 3 samples a day. Fargo can find about a sample every 2 or 3 hours because he could smell it from up to a nautical mile away. So this is when he first detects it. He's very excited. This is the scent cone here, and there's the prevailing wind direction. Just like when you see dogs sallying up, looking on a scent. Fargo's trying to do the same. He's excited. Now he's settled down. He doesn't smell it anymore. So this is when the boat driver changes direction, and then eventually this is when humans can smell it. We can smell it about 100 yards away. Right? So Fargo really helped enhance the number of samples we could find. Good news is high amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron, as we suspected. So the work that we've been doing is looking at, well, how can these nutrients be picked up by phytoplankton? And we've now gone on and worked on a number of papers looking at this nutrient transfer with the help originally of Fargo, but now also looking at some other techniques. One new technique is drone technology. So let's follow this here. There's a drone up top, and there's a tag with suction cups that's on that drone. It's being dropped down. That's a fin whale in the Gulf of California, and that's going to stay on the back of that fin whale for up to about 24 hours. Doesn't hurt the whale. You see the whale didn't even react to that. It's basically like a suction cup that's sticking on there. But the amazing thing that you get from this is now you start to understand what whales are doing beneath the ocean. Because the surface is probably, for a whale's life, the most boring time of its life. But it's really been the only thing that we can watch as humans. Fortunately, a colleague of mine has been putting tags on humpback moms and calves off of Hawaii. For a while, we couldn't show this. It was embargoed. But recently, I'm now allowed to share these with you. So here you get an idea of what it looks like to be a humpback whale, probably a month or 2 old. So a newborn calf And the tag is on its back. It's got a camera on it. Those are mackerel scad, which are fish native to Hawaii that are feeding on the skin that's coming off the mom. This is mom here. That's the calf. And mom is peeing there. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but for me, that was like one of the most exciting things I've ever seen. Now we know whales are peeing in this area. So mom's up top. There's the calf. This is about 1.5 minutes long, but I think it's worth watching. That's milk there that's leaking out. Right on the right there, you can see it's a bit cloudy here. And the fish are also getting excited. They're going to take some of that milk as well. There's mom's pectoral fin up top. So all these nutrients that mom is now releasing, she's been feeding in Alaska throughout the summer. They migrate down to Hawaii, and that's where she's birthing, gestating, birthing, and lactating, and releasing more nutrients across thousands of kilometers rather than up and down. So you're seeing again a little bit of the milk there. The calf is suckling.
How did you get those pictures?
This is my colleague Lars Bader. They put, you saw that the way they released that suction cup tag? They put a suction cup tag on the back with a camera on it. So now the calf can't hold its breath as long as mom, so it's coming to the surface. But it's a camera on the back of the calf that lasts a couple of hours. And then that's Maui in the background. And you can see mom on the lower left there, keeping an eye on the calf. And then another breath, and those are the researchers there in the far distance. So really phenomenal now, the things that we're starting to learn with these new technologies. So the work that I've been doing, and in fact I'm working on the proofs today, I'm hoping this paper will be done at the end before I go to bed tonight, is what we call the Great Whale Conveyor Belt. Again, the whales are feeding off of Alaska, or others in the Atlantic are feeding off of Massachusetts, and then they breed in clear water systems like Hawaii or the Caribbean, and they're releasing nitrogen. You saw the mom peeing. It's mostly through its urine. Mom isn't defecating on these breeding grounds because they're not feeding, but they're bulking up. That lots of blubber and protein, they bulk up in the summer, and then they use it daily in order to feed their offspring as well as just to survive. Some of these areas overlap with nurseries for sharks. So calf mortality is high, just like in lots of animals. Infant mortality is higher if it's that first year. That can be risky. But the sharks, it seems, breed also in these areas because here's a chance for them to take advantage of these nutrients coming in the form of carcasses as well. So whales are having a big impact on these systems, but so are fish. This is parrotfish here. Parrotfish feed on corals, mostly dead corals, but also algae on coral systems. And if you've ever seen one, this is off of Hawaii, they release a plume of sand when they're feeding. It's estimated in some places like Hawaii and some of the low-lying islands that 80% of the sand on those beaches comes from parrotfish and other fish that are feeding on these corals. So when you're lying on a tropical beach, you're often lying on poop. So it's not only the whales that are bringing these nutrients, but also the parrotfish that are building these beaches. There's been some work looking at whether islands, in the face of climate change, if you have enough parrotfish, it seems that the islands might be able to maintain themselves. The islands will be able to grow, given this parrotfish, as the sea level rises. So really important to maintain all of these species in these ocean systems. When whales die, they also provide habitat for more than 100 species unique just to dead whales. And they're called whale fall communities. That's Osedax worm up top. The Osedax worm is only found on the bones of whales. It doesn't have a mouth, It doesn't have a gut, it doesn't have an anus, it doesn't feed, it's basically as a root system providing nutrients to bacteria, symbiotic bacteria, in what's trophosome, what otherwise would be a gut, and surviving there. So these species are dependent on these whale falls. Also, when not all whales sink into the deep sea, when they strand, they can provide lots of food for animals that are feeding scavengers. These are polar bears here. One bowhead whale carcass is about the same as 1,300 ringed seals, which is their normal prey. So you can see why hundreds of their polar bears coming down to feed on this bowhead whale, that might be enough for them to get through a winter. And there's been some research suggesting that historically in interglacial times, the way that polar bears might have survived when they couldn't hunt on ice was feeding on whale carcasses. So essential that we have these bowheads and other animals available to bears and other scavengers. I gave a talk in Reykjavik at the end. I did a fellowship, a Fulbright in Iceland before I went to CSC in 2018, 2019, and spoke about this whale research that I've been doing and realized that all of my research comes down to basically 3 words: eat, poop, die. And that day I was like, and that should be the title of my next book. And so this has been the journey that I've been taking, and I have a couple of copies here, for the past 5 years, is looking not only at whales and seabirds, but how other different animals can shape ecosystems. I do have to give you guys a reality check, because some people will say, well, animals, can they really make that much of a difference? The truth is, we live in a human-dominated planet. Wild animals mammals especially, don't have a big impact. It's because they're so rare. I was shocked by this study, but about 1 out of all 3 mammals on the planet are us. We make up more than 1/3 of the biomass, and livestock make up about almost 2/3 of all biomass of mammals on the planet. Wild animals, including those large whales I just showed you, about 4% of the biomass. So it's not surprising that we don't think of animals as playing a big role, because they are rare. And my effort as a conservation biologist is to try and protect that number and nudge that number a little bit higher to the best of my ability. Similar pattern with birds. 70% of birds on the planet are chickens. Some people call it, we live on a chicken planet. When archaeologists, if there are archaeologists, thousands of years in the future, look back, they're going to find a lot of chicken bones. The good news is, I work for, and I'm fortunate that I work largely on marine mammals. And since I was a kid, things have gotten much better for marine mammals. In the 1970s, whales were really at the point of extinction at that point. It was when the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act were passed, humpback whales and other species were very close to extinction. Completely protected in the United States, moratorium on commercial whaling, and also protection of seals and other pinnipeds. This story is amazing. Northern elephant seals, in around 1900, there were only 20 of them in the whole world. All right, there are more elephant seals in this photograph from Año Nuevo in California than there were on the planet in the 1920s. In the past 100 years, there are now about 180,000 of these now in the North Pacific. This, by conservation efforts between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, shows you that we can restore these animals if we want to. I grew up in New York City. I never saw a whale. I never saw a seal growing up. But there are humpbacks back in New York City now. There are fin whales. There are seals back in that area. The waters are a lot cleaner. There are more fish populations. These were all by legislation and good policy efforts put in the 1970s that continue to be effective to this day and really show you the power of making good decisions in waters as well as on lands. I've been talking a lot about pooping and dying today, but I'll end with talking about eating. And these are one of the most phenomenal success stories. Northern sea otters, they were down also to only about 1,000 individuals off the coast, a remote island of the Aleutians in the 1960s, had been hunted throughout their range. And the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, which I had mentioned earlier, wanted to do a nuclear test on one of those islands. This was around the time that Greenpeace was just starting up. And biologists in Alaska said, look, you're going to have a problem when you set off this detonation. You're going to have a lot of dead otters in your hand. We can do something for you. We have a solution. We'll take your otters and we'll move them back onto the main part of Alaska. So several hundred, almost 1,000 otters were moved from that remote Aleutian island into southeast Alaska, Washington, Oregon. Has anyone seen sea otter? Several hands up. Almost certainly it's a descendant of one of these. About half of all sea otters on the planet descend from those individuals that were airlifted before that explosion. Sea otters, why do I use them for food? They eat a lot. Basically, 25% of their body weight per day. They don't have blubber. They're metabolizing. They're about the size of Zoe, of my dog. My dog would be happy to eat 25% of her body weight a day, I think. But she could maybe get maybe 5 or 6 in. So what's the impact of this food? Here's what it looks like when you don't have sea otters. It's what they're known basically as urchin barrens. So you have large and abundant sea urchins that are feeding on the macroalgae on the kelp in that area. Wide swaths with no kelp. When otters are restored, another classic example, you get these large kelp forests restored to this area, and you can really tell because the sea otters are feeding on those urchins and other invertebrates in that area. When they come back, the system changes almost completely. So another really good example of how animals can change the ecosystems where they're found. There have now been several studies looking at what the impact of rewilding animals, whether we're talking about sea otters or elephants or other species, wolves, and what's the impact of that on climate systems. This is still emerging science. It's still, I would say, debated among scientists. What we do know is that when we restore these animals, the ecosystems can be more resilient and can adapt to climate change in many systems, but we don't know how much they actually mitigate carbon in that system. That's something we're still trying to learn. Here in Vermont, we have moose. Beavers have been restored, and there are now conversations to return catamounts to this area so we can think about what the impact of having large animals around in this state and other states might have, both on the forest systems, the grasslands, but also on the carbon dynamics in these areas. So I'd argue, let's replace our carbon footprint with the tracks of wild animals. This is a photo from CSC, but think of a world where animals are more abundant. Not only for the carbon or the practical aspects, but also just the awe and joy of having these large animals around with us. With that, happy to answer questions, take comments, or hear from you. Thank you.
So, as a veterinarian, I was really glad to see someone who was interested in poop. Because poop is a big part of veterinary medicine, diagnostically, treatment-wise, everything about it. So, 35 years of my life dealing with poop. It's great, so I'm all for it. I also wanted to comment that the slides about the diversity and small number of wild animals that exist are going to be important when we think about both on the state level and on Richmond level, keeping our forest blocks intact, allowing for habitat connectors. This is all going to be super important to allow for those species to remain and be making the forests more resilient. So as a circular process, save the forest, that saves the animals save the forests. So I hope everyone is thinking about that. We're starting to work on our new town plan, and I would like to think that we're all going to be now a little more focused on the fact that we have places here, good quality forests that we can save and apply preservation to help keep these systems going. So anyway, thank you. Very, very good.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I agree completely. I mean, these processes happen on the local scale, like on the scale of Richmond. The Endangered Species Act I mentioned, in the legislation, it was argued at the beginning whether it would include habitat. It's not about protecting the animals, it's about protecting the ecosystems that they depend on as well. So you absolutely need those ecosystems and the animals and the plants. It's the only way it's going to work. And with climate change, we're also going to need migratory corridors, since I spoke about migration. By the way, we could talk a long time about poop and all the things that I spoke about nitrogen, but also looking at hormone levels, stress levels in whales, as well as toxins found and reproductive status. Now we're finding microplastics. So the information that we get is incredible, and why it's important for whales, it's important for all animals, is we want to minimize the amount, how invasive we are, unlike with your domestic animals. So by taking samples from the poop, you're really not disturbing the animal. So that's one of the advantages as well. Thanks for the comment.
All right. My question transitions us from solids to gas. The dairy industry is receiving quite a bit of criticism regarding the production of methane from large factory farms. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a strong comment beyond the concerns, the climate impacts of methane, and whether there are ways to adapt to that, either through different feed sources, or thinking about, how much meat should we be producing, how much dairy should we be producing on a global scale. But absolutely the methane from cows and other ungulates has a climate impact, and a large climate impact. Beyond that, I don't have much of a comment directly.
Thank you.
Question of curiosity, when you were showing the pictures of the whale and the calf in Hawaii, you made a comment in passing that they had not been allowed to show those photos previously. Why?
Well, this is the way of wildlife biology. I think Netflix actually helped pay for that, some of the deployment. So they had embargoed it. So it was actually proprietary. This happens with National Geographic and others. Even though the scientists are allowed to use it for data, you can't always show it publicly. But Lars Bader, who's the lead scientist for that, had to go. There was a certain amount, there's a time limit to how long they had to keep those. So it wasn't anything nefarious. It was really kind of a commercial, agreement with Net. I believe, I'm pretty sure it was Net, but broadcasting company.
Maybe they do this in Vermont, but when we were in the Rocky Mountains a year or so ago, it was very interesting as we were driving along the roads. There were all kinds of tunnels that had been developed going under the roads or over the roads for the wild animals. Are we doing that a lot in this area?
I can think of one example in Moncton. There's an amphibian underpass, and there is an effort. The overpasses are often the best for large animals, but overpasses are incredibly expensive. But absolutely, there are efforts to put more underpasses in this area. Moncton, for example, where I used to live, it has made a tremendous difference. Before that, frogs and salamanders from Moncton to Vergennes, it would be a slaughter in the springtime. And people would go out and try and move them, but but the amphibians move wet, cold nights. So it's not a safe time to be on the road. So by putting these underpasses in, it makes a big difference. So that's one example, but those migratory corridors in heavily trafficked roads are really important for wildlife. Yeah. And there are efforts to do more of those.
So, Joe, I want to thank you. If folks have other,
I have one quick addition, which is if you want to see beavers at work, go to Williston. So the Allen Brook, which is behind the Williston Central School and the library in Williston, is being totally redesigned by beavers. They had at one point a lodge and a dam that they had made to flood, make the pond to put their lodge. They've since kind of either abandoned that one or they've moved to where there was a nice boardwalk going from the Williston Central School track into the Allen Brook Preserve. And they have totally decimated the trees. You can see where the Williston Conservation Commission put little wire sleeves around a lot of the trees so they wouldn't get eaten. But the beavers just flooded the whole thing and the trees are now drowned. So they're dead anyway, they haven't been eaten. And you can see the inroads that they're making up to the track behind the school. Really cool to go and look at the changes there. There's a big lodge there and they've just, we're waiting and the Conservation Commission in Williston says, well, we're monitoring the situation, It is a cool natural experiment and we're wondering if they're going to be allowed to eat all the trees that they want, of the species they want in that area. So a great field trip if you want to go look at that beaver work. Very cool.
So beavers, thank you for that. And they create this dynamic environment. The ecosystems are dynamic, and when beavers come in, they can really change forest systems, water systems. A shout out to them, of course, is that they can reduce the flashiness of river systems. So the flooding that we've had, there's some thought that restoring beavers can help maintain that heterogeneity and lower the flashiness in that area. So, but these are balanced decisions that individual communities make. Yeah, you wanted to.
While on the topic of beavers and what they do, very interesting, and perhaps some of you know this, but in the provincial park of Ontario, north of Ottawa, they had thank you, I'm trained now. Yes, north of Ottawa, in the provincial park, they had quite a problem because of, people cutting into the trees, not the trees, but the land being overtaken for construction. And to redirect the beavers, what they did is they developed a soundtrack system. And so they recorded water running. And wherever they wanted the beavers to start working or relocate, they would install the, solar powered track of water running, and the beavers would come and build a dam there. And they worked them all around the park system till they got wet back into the park environment.
Great. Thanks for that. I love the idea of using sound.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, when we all sit in a room like this and listen to you, someone knowledgeable, and think about and look at those beautiful photographs of the interaction of everything, and getting back to Virginia's first point earlier, I wonder, how does this translate in the real world into this huge boom in outdoor recreation? Today, locally, in our own community, as well as everywhere in Vermont, in the state, in the country. Internationally, outdoor recreation is so huge. We have to, whether it's on the ocean, going cruise ships to see whales, whether it's in our own backyard, building more mountain biking trails to get from here to there and have all this human fun. I worry that in order for humans to experience awesomeness, as people have put it, that we're damaging the exact same thing that we are honoring here, and that clearly science is telling us is so important, not only to our survival, but certainly is to the natural world. So I wonder how you deal with that social need or social desires to have fun.
I don't think there's no easy way to answer that, but a couple of thoughts. One is, national parks are often designed, they want you go to a national park and it's kind of crowded and you're not that happy about it, but that's often by design, is that they don't want you everywhere in Yellowstone, right? So there are often these pinch points. I'm not saying this is the best answer, but there's also, you want to focus human activity in particular areas. As someone who studies whales, now, do whales like whale watching? No. Can it damage whales? Yes. Is it worth it? Probably, though, because I think the awe and people being able to experience whales in the wild, from my view, is worth that balance, as long as it's well managed. But where that fits is not easy, and I'm kind of a in the middle gray guy, I'm not a black and white, so I don't think you're not keeping people out all the time or letting them everywhere. But if you can figure out some way for mountain bikes, that you can mountain bike in parts of the state, but not in all of the state. Some of the parts of the state should be protected for animals and plants and wild ecosystems. That's ideal, but that's a negotiation. I'm more of a biologist than a social scientist. I recognize that, but I also recognize that that's where people that work in that area can give a more informed answer than I can to that. One thing I can say, though, that is exciting, having worked in Massachusetts, is historically the dominant economic activity on the oceans was commercial fishing. That was and now it's commercial fishing, it's whale watching, it's recreation, and it's environmental stewardship is really important. People spend a lot of money, they probably do in Vermont too, in order to protect natural areas. That's part of the economy too. People have jobs protecting the oceans and protecting Vermont, and we should be mindful that that's also a way of being part of these areas, right? It's also being a steward of the environment.
We will take one more question.
At the topic of poop, how are we, as a world community, human beings, how are we handling all our personal poop? Because urine has nitrogen in it and things, but we end up sending it down the rivers, and is there a better way to handle this? Because, like you said, we're the number one mammal in the country.
Absolutely. So you're right. We're the dominant animal in the world, and our domestics. There are studies that show that if we were to reuse the nutrients from our feces and our urine, as well as from that it could, I forget what the number, but let's say, cover 25% of our needs for agricultural fertilizer. That would be a much better use of that, rather than putting it out into the waste stream. There are efforts here in Vermont, like the Rich Earth Institute, that you can bring your urine and they will process it and they'll release it. They'll release it on farms. You can also do it yourself in urine, and there are composting toilets. But I think you're asking on a global scale how we can do a better job. I would say here in the United States, we've gotten better. When I was a kid, there was sludge in the water. It was the water, they were not treating well. So it's treated better, but now I think the goal is to close that loop and recycle it. Unfortunately, it's not easy because we're full of chemicals. So, it's not a simple, let's just go out and put it there. You need to think about whatever the toxins that we have in our body and how to process that. It's doable, but it takes some work.
Well, thank you all. Those were great questions, and Joe, do you have a few more minutes to visit with folks?
Yeah, I'm here. Sure.
And I do again want to recommend these books that Joe has brought for sale. There are several books. The latest, as Joe pointed out, Eat, Poop, Die is a good read. So if anyone wants to buy them, they're right here. So thank you again all for coming, and thanks to Joe.